marketers have an image problem.
Greetings. Welcome back to the Wild Business Growth Podcast, presented by Hippo Direct. This is your place to hear from a new entrepreneur or innovator every single Wednesday morning who's turning wild ideas into wild growth. I'm your host, Max Branstetter, digital marketing dude at Hippo Direct, and you can reach me at max@hippodirect.com for help using your podcast as a marketing tool. This is episode number 93, and today's guest is Douglas Burdett. He is the answer to the question, what would you learn if you read a different marketing book every week? By the way, he's also interviewed the author of that marketing book every week, and he does this for his podcast, The Marketing Book Podcast. He's brought in millions of downloads through the podcast and has been featured as a top podcast by Forbes and Entrepreneur. You'll hear his top takeaways from interviewing so many amazing authors, plus tales from his time as a field artillery officer in the U.S. Army and from his time as a madman during the tail end of the Mad Men era in the agency world. It is Doug Funny. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, we are here with Douglas Burdett, the creator and host of the Marketing Book Podcast, aka the man you do not want to challenge you in a read-off. How you doing today, Douglas?
Great. Good to be talking to you.
Yes, it is a pleasure. I was familiar with your podcast for a while, and I've actually prepared for a lot of my interviews with your episodes because we have so many mutual guests in common, and especially in the marketing space. But we actually didn't meet until we were both on Robin Kennedy's 24-hour podcast-a-thon a little while back. So nice to speak to you, and I hope you've caught up on sleep since then.
Yes, and doesn't it make us sound athletic having been on a podcast-a-thon? It was a 24-hour episode they did, and I met you because you were coming on the show just as I was leaving, and it was sort of like those telethons, where one guest comes, the other one leaves, and so I met you, and we were able to connect. So it's great to be on your show, and hope that what I'm able to share is going to be helpful and of interest to your listeners.
Yes, of course. Well, I'm in support of all sorts of telethons, whether they be 24 hours or not. We could turn this into a telethon if you want to. But it was fun overlapping with you, and I think usually I have to apologize for my dad jokes in advance, and I think you were like, no, I'm way ahead of you, so we should be in good shape here today.
Right, that's right. Yes, and we were even joking. Because it was about 8:00 p.m. here on the East Coast of the U.S., and I don't know what that translated into, midnight, 1 a.m., something like that for them. So it was well into the cocktail hour, and so I was, on fire, talking to them and trying to kind of keep them awake and energized. And I was joking about how I had been listening in a bit, and they seemed to have a lot of American guests when I listened in, and then sure enough, here comes this other American right after me. So then I started to realize that Max, maybe they were putting the Americans in while everyone was asleep anyway. So
yeah, I think that was more than strategic on their part. But anyway, we made it. Maybe been a couple cocktails involved, but anyway, here we are. You have an incredible story in yourself. So we're going to get into your story and the Marketing Book Podcast and some of the lessons and strategic principles and tactics from that world. But before we get into that, I do want to dive into a bit of your background there. So,
okay, well, those charges were dropped, Max. So we agreed not to talk about that.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
kidding.
I'll talk about the other thing. Okay. Right. Let's talk about field artillery.
Field artillery?
field artillery. Yes, this might be where the charges come in. No, but you have a very interesting background in the Army. I'm not sure how much you talk about it, but I'm curious. And I saw a picture on your LinkedIn profile of the I don't know if you call them weapons or machines, the artillery devices that you used. I sound very professional.
Oh yeah,
now.
the howitzer.
Yes, that would be a better
The cannon,
term.
right?
The,
Yeah.
the cannons, and that is like one of the biggest things I've ever seen. And so the fact that you work with and manage those, that was pretty crazy. How would you describe that those years of your life?
It was really loud, Max.
Okay, that's one way to describe it.
No, so I got out of college and I was in the army overseas in Germany for 3 years. Well, back then it was called West Germany, and I was in field artillery unit, in the United States Army, and those are the cannons that support. The military, the army is basically in the real estate business where they're trying to take real estate, and so the artillery is usually back just behind the infantry and the tanks in order to help them assist them in advancing. And so at the time in the early 80s, the United States military and a lot of the NATO countries had a big military presence along the Iron Curtain to deter the Soviets from invading Western Europe. So I did that, and it was very very exciting, and I learned a lot, and it was from that I actually later named my agency, which is called Artillery. So yeah, it was very interesting. It was a real honor to serve, and the longer I'm out, the more I realize just how unique and interesting an experience that was. I didn't want to do it forever though, so I ultimately got out of the army.
Well, appreciate everything you've done, and it's pretty unique. I feel like to have that role there. How did you end up focusing on artillery and the cannons, as I should have just said in the first place, as opposed to going into any of the endless other potential routes when you're in the army?
Well, it's a good question. My dad was an Army general, three-star general, and he had been in the infantry, and his dad had been in the infantry. It goes all the
Oh
way
wow!
back to actually our family. It goes all the way back to the Revolution. When my great 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 grandfather was a lieutenant at the American Revolution, fought at
Oh my god!
Yorktown. I had thought about going into the infantry just because if you're going to go in the army, do one of those things that was real. Sort of army like, what they call the combat arms, like
Do the
infantry.
army like things in the army?
Yeah, right. If I was going to manage an officers club, I guess you could still do that. I could do that in the civilian world. So, it was either I wanted to go infantry or armor or artillery or, something like that. And so I had thought I'd go into the, infantry like dad and all the others had. And I was, between my junior and senior year, and college, and I went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and we had to spend the summer at Fort Bragg as part of the training, and that's where I got a much better idea of what the infantry did, and it just didn't seem quite as interesting, and unless you're really fond of low crawling through sand and bugs and all that sort of thing, but
Sounds like my Wednesday nights.
yeah, right. So I was while we were there, they had artillery day, and that's where they showed us, all this artillery and what they did, and it seemed really interesting. Very a lot of math behind it and the equipment. But the thing that really pushed me in that direction was I must have walked a few hundred miles that summer because you walk the infantry tends to walk a lot of places, and I realized that the armor and the tanks, they get to ride everywhere they go. So from a practical standpoint, I said, all right, it's going to be one of those two. And I was just fascinated by artillery, and I knew they needed artillery officers. And I knew that they needed a lot of them in Europe, and I wanted to go to Europe. So I picked that, and it was really very interesting. So after I then got out of VMI, I went to artillery school in Oklahoma, and then they shipped me off to Germany, where I joined an artillery unit. So, yeah, it was one of those things where it's funny how we ultimately make decisions, but it was one of those lessons that I probably hadn't realized I learned, that if you can do something for a living that at least halfway interests you, you're going to do better at it. So, that kind of went to so I was in the army, experienced that, and I said, okay, well, that's probably one of those lines of work where you really do have to almost have a calling, like being a minister or a rabbi or a teacher or something where it's a real calling. And I think even at that young age, when I got out when I was 26, I thought, now I'm going to really go find something that interests me, because I did a job where it didn't really set me on fire. It was pretty fascinating, but it just wasn't something that really fired my imagination. And so I went to grad school, got an MBA, and while I was there, I started looking at a lot of different fields just to find out something that interests me. And one day, one of my buddies in New York, who was working on Wall Street, a guy I'd been in college with and also in the army with in Germany, and he said, "Have you ever thought of going into advertising? I know you really well, and I know a lot of people up here in New York that work in advertising, and I think you ought to look into that." And I said, "I don't know anything about that." So then I went back to school and asked this one professor who I knew had worked in advertising. I said, "What's one book I could read so I could figure out if this is of interest?" Like I thought I'd wanted to go into banking, and I went and met some bankers and studied up on that. And I thought, oh, this is really, interesting. These are very sharp people. It's just not something that I want to do. So anyway, she gave me a copy of a book that was pretty new in the 80s. It was called Ogilvy on Advertising. And I read that and I thought, holy smokes, that is it. That is so cool. That's what I want to do. So by then I knew, I really got to find something interesting. So what I did was I went on a few interviews with agencies in New York, and I met this one guy, president of an agency, and he goes, "Man, I never see anybody go from the military into advertising." And he said, "I mean, one of them's life and death, and the other one's fun and games." And I said, "Well, which one is which?" So I then thought, oh, well, if that's so unique, basic marketing, I took a picture of me. Actually, it's the same picture of me that's on my LinkedIn profile. You have to dig down there to find it. It was a picture of me on a cardstock, and the headline said, "Ready, aim, hire." And then it had some funny copy under it, and a resume was on the back. And this was before the World Wide Web and email and all that sort of thing. And I got so many interviews and got in with J. Walter Thompson in New York, which is the oldest ad agency in the country and one of the biggest in the world. And that was back when ad agencies were really much more dominant, back when advertising was a real power. Now it's really somewhat of a shadow of its former self because of the internet and technology.
Right. Well, I am a huge fan of the puns. So the fact you're using puns back then and it clearly worked well for you is just incredible.
What did I have to lose, Max?
Right. Exactly. And you had a hell of a picture to support your personal brand there.
That's right. A good supporting visual, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. We'll run with that campaign. But you characterize your time working on those agencies as the tail end of the Mad Men era. Why do you say that? What makes it, besides the location of it, what about the vibes or the atmosphere made it feel like it was still part of in that sort of Mad Men culture?
Because we had a captive audience back then. Now, we didn't have as captive an audience as Don Draper did, where they had maybe 3 networks and,
Mm,
major dailies and print magazines. But when I was there in the late 80s, advertising was really powerful. In other words, younger people may not appreciate this as much, but we had a lot of captive audiences. In other words, we didn't have cell phones to look at. We didn't have really the internet to speak of. Some academics and people in the defense industry might have using it, but it was nobody had heard of it. You couldn't even advance through TV commercials. You had to watch them. So like on Thursday night, everybody knew at 9 o'clock they were going to watch the Seinfeld show or, fill it, whatever it was. And if somebody wanted information, they could go to the library. Maybe they could subscribe to Consumer Reports, but basically, if most people were buying something and they needed to do research, they wanted information, they had to go to the seller pretty early on. And when I give talks, I often illustrate this by asking the audience. I say, when I was a kid and my dad wanted to buy a new car, where was the first place he had to go? And everyone says, well, probably the dealership. And I say, yeah. Why did he go to the dealership? And everyone says, well, there are not really any other places to get much meaningful information. Okay, so at that point, whoever was selling, they knew that customer was fairly early on in their buyer's journey, or whatever you want to call it. And they could then influence them, and they could even exchange information in return for leverage and, a pound of flesh all along the way. Okay, so a couple years ago, my wife wanted to buy a new car, and Max, where do you think the last place in the world she went to get information was?
The dealership.
Wrong. Her husband. Your answer is correct. But
Well,
she,
maybe both correct.
yes, well, no, she was. So I
Anyway,
was actually, yeah, I was away at a football game with a friend at, the Naval Academy, and I was losing battery in my phone, and there was hardly any reception. And she starts texting me saying, "Is $5,000 a month a good monthly? Is that a good payment for a new car?" And I'm like, "What?" I had to borrow my friend's phone and try to get back in touch with her. And she said, "I'm sorry, I had an extra number on there. Is $500 a good month?" So that's when I found out she was buying a new car. But my point is, the last place she went was to the poor guy trying to sell the car. Why? Because she was able to get all the information she wanted from her friends on social media, from doing all kinds of research. Okay, so back to the tail end of the Mad Men. Do you see now what I'm talking about the power that advertising had back then?
it has changed so much. It's
Yeah.
crazy. And if you do watch the show Mad Men, it puts it in perspective. Douglas, before we move on here, I want to bring up one crazy coincidence or thing we have in common. I don't know if coincidence is the right term, but I saw that you worked on the brand Whisk, which actually was the first brand I worked on out of college when I was on the brand side of things.
Oh, really? With
Yeah, yeah.
Lever Brothers in New York?
Well, it changed quite a bit since I think it went back to Unilever, and then the company I actually work with out of school was called Sun Products because they were a private equity backed firm that had combined a private retailer laundry side business from Utah called Hewish Detergents with the national laundry brands of Unilever. So they had taken those from Unilever. So they made their way all
Oh,
through all the different levers, and that has since been acquired by Henkel. And I'm obviously not there anymore. But the
okay,
first
yeah.
brand, like my first experience into like the real world, one of the brands I had was Whisk, which is pretty
Oh,
crazy. It just jumped at the screen at me, jumped into my washing machine when I saw it on your LinkedIn profile.
yeah, it's funny because it had been at BBDO for many, many years, and the slogan was, "Ring around the collar." And,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
so these, it was a bit dated, though, because at the time, it was for women primarily who would, take for the family, and they might feel guilty that they weren't doing the best thing for their family because people could see ring around the husband's shirt collar. Again, this is the old days. So that was fading because at that point women were like, "Honey, I'm working. You can send your shirts out." My identity is no longer quite as tied to the appearance of my husband's shirt collars. So what they did is they had kind of a creative shoot off between J. Walter Thompson and BBDO. We were both, Unilever clients or agencies in New York and all around the world. We had clients all around the world for that company, and they had a creative shootout. And what we did, and then we would create this creative, and then we would shoot it, and then we would test it. And Jay Walter came up with this idea of, I think it was, the slogan was "Tisk tisk tisk, whisk whisk whisk." Yes, very heavy on the repetitiveness and the alliteration. But what was interesting, so anyway, it won, and the account came over. But the creative director at BBDO was a guy named Jim Jordan, and an older fellow, a father, and his son was JJ Jordan, who worked at J. Walter. So it went from father to son, from one agency to another. But that was kind of an interesting little footnote. But yeah, I worked on that, and I think the very first account I worked on was a deodorant soap called Lever 2000, which was at the time in test market, and it was the first time Unilever had come out with a product with their name on it, which Procter and Gamble's never done still.
Right. Yeah. Who are they? No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting the launches they come up with. I'm sure we could talk about detergents for the rest of the time here, but so
Hmm.
we'll spare that. But I just thought that was a cool tidbit. Changed quite a bit. I am sad to say I think Whisk is pretty much no longer around unless there's some
Oh,
clearance
really?
ones. Yeah, they kind of
Yeah,
it
maybe I
was
should update
I
my
basically I think I
LinkedIn
ran into the ground
profile.
is what happened. Yep.
Well, I'm sure I gave it a good start.
There were a lot of change. I mean, by the time I was on it, it was they were called a regional brand because it was such a small, it had such a strong focus in the Northeast as opposed to national. A lot of change, but anyway, so that's so this has been the Whisk podcast.
Yeah, I've worked on some other brands that are no longer around, more or less like Toys R Us. I was in the Toys R Us account. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of some others that were really old brands that were still hanging around, like Brill Cream and Electric Shave and things like Tops baseball cards. They're still around, but
Let's get to the Marketing Book podcast. So, if you're not familiar with the Marketing Book podcast, somewhere along the way, Douglas, you had this crazy idea to not only read a different marketing or sales book every week, but also interview their author and have them on your show and put it out every single week since I think somewhere in the middle of 2015. So you've had quite the run already, probably not much sleep there. Where did this crazy yet beautiful idea come from?
I was drunk, obviously. No, I
That's the answer to everything.
I was in advertising for a long time, and even when I started my own company, it was very much advertising. That was my background. And within the last 5 to 10 years, I started to notice that world that I like so much was just permanently changing. It would probably be like a travel agent 25 years ago saying, "What's with this internet? And why are people not, people can't make their own travel arrangements?" And so the advertising I could just see that it was going away permanently. I still had advertising clients, but I started to feel like I was growing dinosaur scales. I was having to go to client meetings, and I really, really hated feeling like a sort of irrelevant person. And I wasn't completely irrelevant, but I was very super sensitive to that, like being washed up. And you'd bring website people to your client meetings, and they kept asking about this fad called the internet and social media, which clearly is going to go away. It got worse and worse, and I kind of went back to what I was doing in grad school. I started reading more books just to figure out what's my next move. Gosh, this gig is up, and I stumbled on a, the first edition of David Meerman Scott's book, The New Rules of Marketing and PR. And that had sort of a revelatory effect on me, kind of like the way when I read Ogilvy on Advertising. And I thought, oh, that's where it's all going. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's all clear now. The clouds have parted, and that's where I want to go. That's what I want to do. And so started to pivot the business, started getting into digital marketing, started a blog, doing all the social media. But I'm still stung by how I just didn't know what was going on. And, many might argue I still don't, but I kept reading the books. I kept reading books because I just thought I never want to be caught again where I'm just completely clueless. I'm comfortable being kind of clueless. That's been a large part of my identity most of my life, Max. So
That's how I knew you. Yeah.
so I would read these books, and then I would go to a marketing conference, and I'd like know the author was going to be there, and I would have already read their book on a Kindle. I would go buy a copy of the book, put it in the suitcase, fly to the conference, just so I get their autograph. Some people collect autographed sports memorabilia. I collect autographed sales and marketing books. So I also like listening to podcasts, and particularly marketing podcasts, and I really enjoyed when an author was interviewed. So I saw some 6 years ago. I started to think, I think I might want to try this podcast thing. And so I said, gosh darn it, I'm going to do it. And so I put together 11 videos pitching 11 authors saying, I'm starting this podcast. And, we met at this conference, but I don't, I know they probably didn't remember who I was, but I'd love to be able to interview you. And 200th episode, I finally interviewed the 11th person, but I got a great start. The very first guest was David Meerman Scott. And he's been a big supporter of the podcast, and he's been on 4 times now, I think. And so I basically started the podcast that I wanted to listen to. And it was probably about the 10th interview in when I realized, because I'd already read about the first 10 books anyway. And that's when I realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually going to have to read each one of these books going forward. It was like missing the turnoff on the interstate, realizing it's going to be another 25 miles before you can turn around. So I was like,
Oh no.
oh yeah, Douglas, yeah, it's just one more thing you didn't really think through.
So
So,
that really didn't hit you until after you got the ball rolling?
well, I guess maybe I'd thought of it, but it was sort of like, yeah, let's just get started. Ready, fire,
Yeah.
aim is
We'll worry
so
about that later.
yeah.
There
So
goes all my free time.
yeah. So, but you know what? It's not that difficult to read just one. I only do one interview a week, and I read the book, and I let's be honest, I love doing it, and I get excited being able to talk to the authors. So, I read it on the weekend, a couple hours here, a couple hours there, a couple hours maybe in one of the mornings leading up to the Friday interview, and then I do it. So that's what prompted me to do it, and I just kept doing it. And why do I do it? It's not, I don't do this for a living, but I get out of it. I learn so much, and it's so helpful for my business, and it's so helpful for clients. I'm never short of ideas to help. But then the thing that keeps me going is that this notion of helping others, I know it's really pretty relevant right this minute as we're in
Yeah.
pandemic, but just when I may occasionally think, maybe I should stop doing this. I'll get a message from a listener from somewhere in the world, and they'll say, "Hey, man, I've been listening to your show for like 2 years now. I don't know what compelled me to do this, but I wanted to let you know I really appreciate it. I've gotten a lot out of it." And I'm like, "Oh, well, I can't stop now.
Yeah. Now
I'm
you're
helping people. They like it, So then I just keep doing it. But it's something I just really enjoy doing."
you've created a no exit scenario for yourself. That's pretty miraculous there. No,
Yeah.
it's
Well, you know what else, Max? It's sort of like professional development is performance art. If the listener can get just a fraction of what I'm getting out of it, that's great.
right. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's incredible what you're doing, and I don't think there's too many people out there that can keep up the pace of all the reading and all the everything else involved in the podcast, and keep it going that consistently for so long, especially when they didn't know beforehand that they were going to have to read the books.
Well, I didn't think that through. It's like when I was in the Army and I was going to airborne school where they had to jump out of perfectly good airplanes,
Oh,
and ideally with a parachute. And the very first time I was going up, and you get up there and the doors open on the plane, and I was actually, for some odd mathematical reason, I was going to be the first guy out of the plane on my very first jump. I remember, we were like 1,200 feet off the ground. This cargo plane's flying in the air, and I'm like, Douglas, I knew, I guess intellectually this was going to happen, but I remember saying to myself, dude, you really think these things through before you go through with them. So everything turned out well. And of course, if you don't really want to about issue anyway, because there's a whole line of other people behind you that have to get out of the plane while it's still over the land zone. So it was a similar sort of thing. So
well, I think it's kind of a blessing in disguise there, because I think if you were to overthink things or think about all the consequences of everything, then there'd probably be far less opportunities that you'd actually move forward with. So really,
probably so.
it's kind of nice. It's a blessing in disguise that you haven't allowed yourself to think through all those. I know I'm guilty of that as well with a lot of things.
Well, and if my wife had overthought things, she would have never married me. So let's, there,
I was
there are
going to say
upsides to it. Yeah.
all sorts of other consequences from that. But you have spoken to everybody who's anybody in the world of marketing, in the world of marketing authors. And that sounds very professional
Well,
there.
tried to,
But
yeah.
I'm sure there's a number of lessons. I mean, you've talked about how it's wonderful if your listeners take in lessons, just a fraction of the lessons that you take away. What would you say in these hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and I know there's been plenty of recurring guests, authors as well, what would you say are some of the key themes or key lessons that keep coming up, and you can't seem to get away from because they are so prevalent?
That is a great question. And
Well, thank you.
when I have passed certain milestones like 100 episodes or 250 episodes, I've given these talks, and they are sort of about that topic, like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what are those things that keep rhyming? As I read through all of these hundreds of books, what keeps coming up that works really well? So last one I did was I put a talk together on 3 big ideas from over 250 marketing and sales books that every marketer needs to know. And These are the three. You ready? The first one is, and again, this is an opinion piece, folks, but the first one is that marketers have an image problem. And there is research I can point you to. In fact, I can even give you a link to this particular episode that includes all the slides if you want to share that in your
Oh,
show
perfect.
notes.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
People can read the script and the slides, but there's been a lot of studies and a lot of books I've read where they talk about the perception of marketers, that being arts and crafts party planners who work in the make it pretty department. And that's not what marketers do, but that doesn't matter because that's the perception of an overwhelming number of their colleagues who aren't in marketing. And that's why even a study by the Fourniers Group in London that talked about how 80% of CEOs did not trust their CMOs, meaning they did not trust that their chief marketing officers understood the financial realities of their companies.
Oh my
That's a
God.
glaring indictment. And if you look at all the thousands of board positions of publicly traded companies, I think it's only double digits of people on boards who had even a marketing background. There's some connection there. There have been some books about, like I said, that talk about this. And there was one book by Thomas Barta and Patrick Barwise, one of whom was a former McKinsey partner, and they analyzed a massive amount of data about perceptions of marketers, and it reaffirmed that that's what people think of marketers. And what they explain is that the really successful marketers are in the revenue camp. They couldn't have been clearer about that. And that's not the only book where they talked about that, where marketers who are able to associate what they're doing with revenue do very well. And those who don't tend to get asked to leave ultimately. In other words, like I gave this talk a while back, and the guy, very sharp marketer, came up to me and says, "Man, you really got me thinking. They think of me and my group as just the trade show guys." You know what I mean? So that's where there's ways that you can learn how to get more in the revenue camp. But one of them is to figure out, who's our most profitable customer? What's the customer lifetime value? There is a little bit of accounting and math, but it's not hard. It's fourth grade level math. But if you know some of those things, you will be perceived very differently and trusted by your management. So that's marketers have an image problem. The second thing that just keeps coming up over and over again is that the most successful companies and the most successful marketers have the deepest insights into their customers, period. And what I mean by that is that they are obsessed about observing and figuring out where the friction is in their customers' lives. And what it means is you don't go to the sales team and say, well, what does the customer say they want? That's exactly not what I'm talking about. It's about, like Amazon, they're obsessed with finding friction in their customers' lives. Did you know that they invented one-click ordering? They patented that. They later licensed it to Apple because Steve Jobs said, I'm not going to invent that. Let's just get it from them. There's this idea of buyer personas, and there's a really good book. It's one of my favorites called Buyer Personas by Adele Ravella. And she talks about there's really only 5, at least in B2B marketing, there's like 5 insights you need to find out about, and you will have an unfair advantage. We've seen that with clients. So they have these really deep insights. And I have to cut back the number of quotes from books when I give that talk that talk about how basically the better you understand your customers, the more successful you're going to be. You're going to be able to introduce better products. Customers are going to think that you understand them better. They will pay more to you if you understand them better. So it's all about understanding customers. And I'll give you an example. And Steve Jobs is overused as an example, and he did a lot of things that really were not best practices. And he was a terrible example to CEOs in the startup world. But he is an example. He, like Henry Ford, they had really deep insights into what people wanted. And so if he were to say, well, what can I give you that's better than a flip phone? People would have said, I don't know, it's pretty good. I can talk on it. They wouldn't have known what to ask for. But he was obsessed with understanding what they truly wanted, from an emotional standpoint or functional standpoint, and then delivering that. Like if somebody had said, what would make for a better taxi service? Most people would have just said, some minor upgrades to doing it. If somebody else had described a ride sharing app like Uber or Lyft, They would have never come up with that on their own, but they would have said, yes, that's what I want. See what
Right,
I'm saying?
exactly.
So the last one that just keeps coming up over and over and over again is that the most powerful marketing that any organization has is the experience that people have with you. So, in other words, there's a Maya Angelou quote, which I'm going to misquote, but she talks about how people will forget what you said, that people will forget what you did, but they're never going to forget how you made them feel. And the reason customer experience, this is different from customer service, which is more reactive, which you still need to have, but customer experience is like, think of like a Disney or a hospitality place where they're proactively engineering, all the touches that a customer has. It's easier, maybe a little bit easier with e-commerce, but when you've got humans involved, it's really difficult, but it works really well. So more and more companies are paying attention to what's the experience that has interact with us, and how can we more proactively engineer a better customer experience, because that is the most powerful marketing. The reason why is because now everybody can tell everyone else about the experience they've had, and everyone has a megaphone, and the companies can't control the message like they used to. So, one of the great examples is this guitarist who was on a United Airlines flight about to take off, and they were loading up the luggage, and he saw that he recognized his guitar case, and these guys were smashing it up. They tore it up. It was a $3,000 guitar. I mean, he was a professional musician. And he went to United and said, look, guys, look what you did, and they completely blew him off. He said, I need you to make me whole on this thing. This is my life. It's all on and on. They couldn't have been more ugly to him and dismissive. So he wrote a song called United Breaks Guitars. And unfortunately for United, he's a really good songwriter. And he put it on the internet, called United Breaks Guitars. Within a short amount of time, the value of United's stock dropped 10%. We're talking billions of dollars.
Oh my God.
And there was nothing else that changed. So that's like one of the great case studies of everybody's got a megaphone now if it's a bad enough experience. So the problem is that it's a cultural change for some companies. And if your CEO says to you as a marketer, you marketing person, come here, you're now in charge of customer experience, you really need to be careful, because they're giving you a lot of responsibility and not a lot of authority. Unless you have a lot of C-suite support, it's going to fail, because then they're going to say, yeah, we tried that once, it doesn't work. It's like the person I heard years ago who at a panel discussion, he said, advertising doesn't work. I ran an ad once and nothing happened. The customer experience that you have now, what marketers need to know, and a lot of really good ones are doing this, is they are advocating for customer experience. In other words, they're helping their companies understand why this can be so financially benefit if they proactively engineer a better experience for their customers.
Well, I appreciate you sharing the key takeaways there, key highlights. I think what's so cool about your show is you do see some themes that come up time and time again, but there's so many different examples. And if you pick any episode and dive into it, you're going to get real life applications to it. You're going to get case studies, and there's endless marketing books out there, but you cover the most important topics and seemingly always find a new fascinating author. So your show has been downloaded over 1 million times, which
Yeah, just over 1.5 recently.
1,000,005. There we go. Well, first of all, congratulations. But I think that's something that so many podcasters strive to achieve, is kind of that million mark. And yes,
Yeah.
there's debate about vanity metrics and all that, but any way you put it, that's an incredible amount.
If you do it long enough, you'll get you'll get the downloads. But the truth is, most podcasts, according to Libsyn, one of the big servers, you may use their service.
Yeah, I do actually. Read my mind.
They report that most podcasts never make it to episode 8.
Right. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you stick with it, it's like probably you've heard this many times as it relates to content marketing. Just slow and steady wins the race. But, it's like I produce this and I'm doing it because for these personal reasons, but also what I do is I ask questions about things that I think either the listener would find helpful or questions that I think a lot of people are struggling with or just something that surprises me.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to start because if it surprises you or interests you, odds are there's others, could be hundreds, could be thousands, could be dozens, could be millions of people that are interested in that same thing. So I think that's a good thing to start with, regardless of your audience size.
Imagine you started your own podcast. You're growing your brand, sharing your expertise, maybe even your terrible puns, and meeting fascinating people. That is awesome. Now, imagine all the hours you've lost every week due to the podcast's demands. Not so awesome. I am your podcast producer. Email me at max@hippodirect.com.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's get to a segment on inspiration and creativity. So here we typically dive into how you stay creative and inspired. And something I ask so many guests about is what they're consuming. I call it resources, but it's really books, magazine, what are you watching? What are you reading? For you, we know you've read a book or two. So I want to focus in on some non-marketing related things that you've learned, just more about the reading process in general. Because personally, I do love to read, but I always find it a challenge to carve out time and actually go through it, just because I feel like I don't read too fast, or said otherwise, I read like a turtle. So, what have you picked up from, these hundreds of books that you've read, as far as things you can do to be quicker and more efficient with reading, or just any kind of intangible tips like that you've picked up along the way?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that it is so easy for me to read a book every week because I'm on this, you know, fun podcasting treadmill where, I
I like
have an
it.
interview scheduled with an author and I want to make sure I've got it read. So actually, it's probably easier for me than just about anyone else. That's part of it. So, when you think I'm, doing this hard work, actually it's kind of built in where, it's a routine. So first off, I have to select the books that are on the show. And the funny thing is that when I started it, I wasn't sure there'd be 52 marketing books written a year. And there are
Oh, were you
evidently.
wrong?
Yeah, now I get books show up at the office almost every day now. And some of them, so it's and then I found out that just the fact that they're on the show, some listeners are just buying them. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, now I really got pressure on to make sure these are not only good interviews, but they're good books. So I have really look at them very hard. So the book selection is very important, and kind of like we were just talking about, it's got to be something that's of interest to me, or maybe it's a topic that I haven't had on the show before, like a very specific area, like affiliate marketing or channel sales or something specific.
Yeah.
And then I look to see if it's from a major publisher because those tend to be better edited. I've had some self-published books, and most of them are good, but there are a few that were just awful, and I could tell they didn't have an editor. And again, hardly any of them. Most were good. So what I then do is, but I'll read the first chapter and I'll study it and I'll see. Do a little bit of look, and I may actually look up if they've been on other podcasts or if they've got a video of them talking, just to make sure that they sound like a good guest. Most are. Then what I do is I usually do the interview on Friday. So on Saturday morning, I'll sit down and read the next week's. So Saturday and Sunday, maybe I'll read 2 hours a day. And I always have to read a hard copy. I can't, there's something about reading it on a screen that just doesn't work for me. Plus I mark it up
Yeah,
to, the
I get
questions I
that.
might want to ask. Yeah. And then maybe Monday, or one of the mornings when I don't work out, which I haven't been doing lately because the gyms are closed and my shoulders in a sling. But because I just had this operation we were talking about before we started
Yeah,
recording,
yeah.
which was very successful.
Congratulations again. I got
It was a rotator cuff repair, so it makes me sound like a major league baseball pitcher. So then I'll read those, and then so that's what is that up to 2, 4, 6, 8? I think I don't think I'm not that fast a reader, but I think that if, at least here in the United States, where we have miles rather than kilometers, the rule of thumb is that if it's a 200-page book, it takes about as long as it would take to drive 200 miles. So what would that be? About 4 hours, maybe?
200 mile. It depends if you're driving on a little over 3, I guess.
Yeah, something like that. So I kind of
Ballpark.
figured that out, and most books are 200 pages or less. Some have been much longer, but with a good reason. But so that's kind of, does that answer your question about how I do it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, you mentioned the marketing podcast treadmill there, marketing book treadmill there. You're just a workhorse with it. So I was wondering how you approach that. And so it makes sense. I mean, no matter if you have a podcast where you have to read it every week or not, I think it helps to kind of create a goal and force yourself to read, X amount every week or every couple of days, something like that. Clearly it works for you to carve out a few hours each day like that.
Have you ever heard of the notion of having a workout partner,
Yeah.
where you like a running partner where you both meet early in the morning or whatever? That's really what I have. So what I would suggest is that people form some book clubs at work, or you could
Yeah.
even do them on Zoom. It really would help. You don't need to read a book a week, folks. There's, but if maybe you read 12. In fact, there was so we're a HubSpot agency partner, and a lot of us talk to one another, and there's a group of us that have started a book club. And what they'll do is they'll have a dozen books up there, and everybody votes on what they want to read next, and then everybody reads it, and then they come on. And a couple times they even brought the author on. A lot of the books were books that had actually been on the Marketing Book Podcast, because it's very similar interests. But I would suggest that folks put together a some kind of book club. I'll give you an example, and if I can help anybody do that, I'd be happy to show up virtually for your first book club meeting and get you going. But there was
There we go.
in London, the Salesforce.com, their London office, they were interested in starting a book club at work. And they said, we want to set this up. Could you come? This is what put the idea in mind. I said, could you join us via Zoom for our first meeting? It's going to be at lunch in London, and whatever. And I said, well, just send me a British Airways ticket. No. So I joined them on Zoom, and that's how they did it. I think employees really liked it too, because people do want to feel like they're learning something, and it kind of gets them out of the work groove, and you get to meet other people at work. And I would suggest people do that. And if I can help, kick it off and energize your first one, just let me know, and I'll jump in there. And in fact, what I could do is I could send whoever is interested a link to this one page that has every single episode, like links to every episode, and they can look through there and maybe think about what books they might want to focus on.
That would be awesome. Well, appreciate you being so generous. It reminds me of a previous guest I had on, Emily Hockman, who founded Wellery, which is all about connecting those who are interested in eating better and better lifestyle choices with certified health trainers, and she calls it accountability buddies, because you need that person
Oh, I
for
love that. That's great.
yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. It's a buddy who holds you accountable. And so that, whether it's something in the, fitness or wellness world or reading books, something like that can totally help. So I think
Hmm.
you can champion that as well. So let's get to a fan favorite segment called the Wild Business Shout Out of the Week.
The Wild Business Shout Out of the Week.
Wild Business Shout Out of the Week. This is where we talk about a brand or campaign that caught our attention. And some of the other recent guests have talked about this as well, but have all been really different and really amazing examples of, at this time of recording, there's, as you mentioned, there's the pandemic going on, and so many businesses are completely changing up what they're doing, especially on the production side and hospitality side, for the greater good and just to do whatever they can to pitch in. And you mentioned something about a resort. Can you share the example that came to mind for you with the resort?
Yeah, it's deeply personal. So I think it's an example of what a lot of companies are doing during the pandemic. I think they're doing it really well, and they're being very generous and very human. And it's really easy to make fun of these companies, like the electric company that sent me a email yesterday that said, "Thanks for paying your electric bill. We're here for you in COVID-19." It's like, oh, give it a rest, people. And it was anyway. I live in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, and my son, who recently graduated from college, he's a an EMT right now in the Outer Banks and also in Virginia Beach, a volunteer in Virginia Beach. And we were concerned because he's a first responder about him getting the coronavirus. And secondarily, we were concerned about him bringing it home because now his younger sister is here. She came home for spring break. She's a senior in college, and the school then sent an email that said, don't come back and don't plan on a graduation ceremony either. I mean, they had to send that. Everyone's getting those messages. So she's
Yeah.
here. And so we started wondering, like, well, is there a place where we could rent for him, where he could kind of quasi self-quarantine and not come home? And this isn't some sinister idea that the parents have to get their son out of the house.
Thank you for clarifying that.
It's great having him home. We really
That answers
love
that
having
one.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love having him live here. Of course, he's never here because he's always out working, or they're sending him to become a paramedic. And he really loves that line of work. So there was a resort at the Virginia Beach oceanfront. A lot of hotels out there just empty now. They're completely closed down. And this one company called Diamond Resorts, and I don't think they're even based here, and I'd never heard of them, but they said, we've got these properties, I guess, around the world, and if there's any coronavirus first responders that need a place to stay, probably, a situation like our son, they said, stay with us, stay for a month, stay for 2 months, no charge.
Wow.
And I thought that was incredibly generous. So now he's at this suite at the Virginia Beach oceanfront with a full kitchen. And we just thought that is really fantastic. And I think they put one blog post. You go to diamondresorts.com, you'll find it. But there's like one blog post, and it was the CEO who just said, I mean, they're probably getting hammered. And but they said, we've got these properties. Let's do something here. And so I've seen that with other companies. So naturally, that's a personal thing. But there's others, like I was talking to Joey Coleman the other night for this series that I'm doing lately called Authors in Quarantine Getting Cocktails, where I'm interviewing an author once a day while drinking cocktails.
Which is brilliant, by the way. That's
Thank you.
a wonderful little baby you've created.
So, well, I wanted to do something, and I was thinking, what can I do? How can I help? Because I was starting to hear from a lot of listeners, and some of them were saying I've been laid off, and all this sort of thing. And I just thought, let me just do something. What can this knuckleheaded podcaster do? So I sent an email out to, there's over 200 authors I've interviewed. I sent an email out to over 200 of them. And I just said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing where I would basically talk to an author for half an hour every day and about what they're thinking and what they're doing and how their life has changed. And I'll just publish it every day, except the Fridays when I publish the normal one. And within 1 hour, I heard from over 100 authors
No
say,
way.
I know. They said, yes, Douglas, I'd love to do this. Several of them said, I'm drinking anyway. So, but they're all grounded. A lot of them are big speakers. And so I've started doing that. Now, why was I telling you that? Because
That was because I got you off track.
No. But I was answering something else about, oh yeah. So I was talking to Joey Coleman, who wrote Never Lose a Customer Again. Excellent book. And he was talking about how, I believe it's Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Normally if you're under 25, you can't rent a car. It's really difficult. But when all this happened, they said, look, as I understand it, look, if you're a college student, don't worry about being under 25. Come rent one of our cars so you can get home. They couldn't get flights. So it's kind of like, it's almost like after 9/11 where suddenly people were in other parts of the country and they couldn't get home. And so they did that. Or you're hearing about, like I had bought some tickets on Delta to go to my daughter's graduation. Well, canceled that. And then they started sending emails saying, look, it's not going to be a change or cancel fees. And you've got a year to use this. And then they came back and said, take 2 years. I would like to have had the money back, but these were probably non-refundable. And there's just certain things where a lot of companies are doing things to help. And that is a great example of, and I love seeing that. And what I mean is it's not they're saying, hey, buy this for 25% off. It's our COVID special. And it's just like, people are going to remember that for a long time. And you are doing serious damage to your reputation. But others are doing things like there's a distillery in my town. Of course, I would know about that, Gosh, I can't remember the name.
No.
I haven't actually been there, but they a friend of mine has it's nearby, and I think I saw that on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you can pull up, and they'll just give you you buy it, the booze, the bourbon, and they'll bring it up to your car, obviously curb service. But they also started making hand sanitizer. They give you a bottle of their own hand sanitizer too.
Here we go. Well, it's got alcohol in it, right?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of these breweries and distilleries were making hand sanitizer, but it's just things where people are saying, look, there's another example. I was talking to a friend of mine in Birmingham, Alabama, and because I did a webinar for the American Marketing Association chapter there, and one of his clients was a security camera company. I think it's called Call Course, and kind of like an ADT kind of company. And they were hearing about these restaurants that were shuttered, that were being burglarized. And they weren't clients of this company, but they reached out to them and said, look, it's making our heart ache seeing your business getting broken into. Your business is closed. Can we put some security cameras in there so that you can keep an eye on it? And we'll help too. And then if you're able to come back, if you want to keep them, you certainly may, and you can become a customer of ours. But if not, that's fine. We just need to come pick up the equipment later. I mean, what else are they going to do? I mean, they were being very helpful and generous. They were helping instead of trying to coerce somebody or be so self-centered. And I think that, I think there's another generation of marketers out there that are going to really get in better touch, or businesses, I should say, the marketers, a lot of them know this, is that, the more that you're able to serve your customer and understand what their fears and aspirations are and desires, you're going to do better. And this is a great example of companies that are doing that.
Yeah, and I think when you think about it that way, if your options are help versus coercion, it's a pretty easy answer there.
Yeah, yeah.
So those are some great examples there. First of all, thank you. Make sure to extend your thanks to your son who's out there on the front lines, because that's incredible, and I'm glad that he was given a good setup to where he can rest and get ready to go back out there. If that suite is nice enough, he's never going to want to come home. So you might have a new problem on your.
Yeah. Well, at that point, he can pay for his own place. But again, I know everybody makes fun of getting their kids to move out of the house, but I mean, he's only 25 and he's a great guy. He's really, really easy to be around. I just have to tell this other funny joke. A year and a half ago, I had this pain in my lower right side, and I thought, what a weird place to pull a muscle while I was working out. And I went to work, and it was just kind of getting worse. It was getting a little harder and harder to breathe. And I just happened to mention that. I said, God, this is the weirdest thing. It was, for me, it was like, yeah, isn't this funny? Anyway, he asked me a couple questions, and I wasn't really paying attention to what he was asking. And he said, Dad, that doesn't sound good. Now, he's trained. And I didn't know that he was listening to me as a medical professional. He goes, can I take you by the urgent care place just so we can rule out that it's not something that we should be concerned about? And I thought, oh, okay, sure. So we drove over there, and they do what they can at an urgent care place, x-ray, take blood. And they said, Mr. Burdett, we're not sure what this is, but we think you better get to the emergency room. Long story short, I went to the emergency room, a couple blocks away. They did a CT. It was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in your lung. And it was like, everything was fine. They got rid of it, and they said it may never happen again. But it was like, Harry, I really don't want you to feel like you have to move out of the house anytime soon, because you may have just saved my life. So
wow.
Yeah,
well, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear you're feeling better. It's it's
that
amazing.
It was just a
you discovered
fluke, yeah.
that, and that when you combine that with your shoulder, I think you're going to be half robot in the next few months here. So
yeah, no, there's no stopping me now.
you're gonna turn to a machine. You're gonna be back on that MLB mound and throwing 150 miles per hour. It'll be great.
Yeah, in my dreams, but I appreciate that. Yeah.
Not that there's a smooth way to follow that up, but I would like to wrap up with some rapid fire Q&A. You ready for it?
All right, I'll do my best. Hit me.
All
Actually,
right.
I should tell you, rapid fire. I've been hospitalized twice in my life for concussions sustained in boxing matches. So as long as you don't actually hit me, we should be fine.
I will not hit you. I will also probably not ask you rapid fire questions because I get sidetracked for every question, and I already am as we speak. So first question, what is your favorite adult beverage?
My favorite adult beverage. Oh my goodness. I have to pick one. I would say single malt scotch.
Wow, you took the I'll pick one to the next level and being just one lone malt.
Yes, yes, that's right. Well, I do product testing. Yes, and that's a yeah, I like that. And actually, as a secondary answer, I know this is going to sound weird, but you learn so much from your kids. I like those hard seltzers. Like
Oh,
White Claw and Truly, a White Claw,
yeah.
bro.
What's your brand, bro?
Oh, I don't know. We got Truly in the fridge now, which I think my daughter bought at Costco, and that's fine. But I don't know. I'm almost liking that better. Maybe it's a phase I'm going through.
I don't personally like them, but they are crazy power. Now, whenever I'm drinking beer, my girlfriend Dana is drinking White Claw, and I
Hmm.
know my brother and cousins, a lot of them like Trulies, but it seems like White Claw is crazy popular. Anyway, here we are, and we're still on this first question. So,
Sorry.
second question: is there anything that you collect, like in addition to books? Is there anything else you collect or once collected?
Yeah, once. Well, I do have a gun collection.
But basically, the same thing as books.
Yeah, well, I have. It's not a big collection. I mean, because if I continue it, I have to get a second safe. But I'm a hunter, and I was in the military, and I've got some weapons that some historical weapons, and my dad was a big gun collector, so that might be one. But otherwise, the autograph sales and marketing books, but not too much. Not much more than that. I don't think.
Yeah, that's probably more than most people. Yeah, I bet you got stuff going back to the Revolutionary War as well.
Well, actually, no, but what my dad did is he had a collection of every rifle the American soldier used, the main battle rifle, going all the way back to the Revolution, and
Oh my god.
it's now been donated to a museum. So, growing up, there were all these rifles around, these beautiful rifles on the walls. So, yeah, that was quite a collection he had. But that was a lifelong passion. But that's an interesting question, and I don't.
I had a feeling you grew up in a museum or of some sorts. So that that
Really.
makes that makes sense there. On that note, you mentioned at the start that the howitzers are very, very loud. For the average person who's never been near one when it went off, how would you characterize that? Like, what was it like when those things would fire?
Well, it was. I don't know what the decibels were because, except in artillery school, I was never the one pulling the lanyard, which hit the firing pin, which activated the explosion that sent the projectile downrange. So I was, before they'd say fire, I'd put my hands up over my ears. But I think what people don't realize is there's a lot of concussion, if that's the right term, where you really can feel. It's like if you're standing in front of a big speaker at a major rock concert and you can feel the sound waves.
Oh, yeah.
It's just really, really loud. And what's funny is, well, funny to me, not to my wife, but she would we've been married 28 years now, and was. This won't ever happen to you if you get married, but I'm sure this never happened to any of your listeners, but the guys, where you're accused of not listening to your wife. Like, are you listening to what I'm saying? And I said, I'm sorry, it's just that hearing damage from the artillery. That didn't even work the first time I tried that. Yeah, she did not fall for that at all. So
Oh, you had a built-in excuse and she busted you on it right away. Oh,
yeah,
well, I
yeah.
learned quick. And then last one, what is a weird talent that you have? So what's something, and this isn't like a hobby. This is like something like you're really good at putting up picture frames evenly without a measuring, or like you have a really good memory trick where you always can say things backwards, but I don't know. That's that's a
Yeah.
bad example of a memory, but you know what I mean. Like an intangible thing that doesn't affect your business, but you're just really skilled at it.
Well, I'll tell you one that my wife has remarked upon over the years where I would hear a TV commercial, and if it was a famous actor, and it wasn't because I was reading the advertising press, but I would say, do you know whose voice that is? Like Gene Hackman used to be the voice of Lowe's. He may still be doing, I don't know. But it's
Oh,
like I would always be able to pick out who an actor was on a voiceover. If it was a famous person, because they didn't always say, this is, they would just, like, for instance, the guy that plays Don Draper, John Hamm,
Yeah,
he's
him.
the voiceover for Mercedes. Just, I mean, that's more a recent example.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I would not have remembered the car commercial, like what brand it was, until you said that, but I do remember his voice in commercials now that you say that.
Yeah, and I don't think they ever say, he never says his name, and I'm not sure it works real well because the commercials he has to talk real fast, and I think that was a little bit of a mismatch. But they didn't ask me, so but it's
Yeah,
cool,
clearly.
and that might be one. I guess looking
That's a great
back,
one.
I have in the past been able to imitate people, and I was particularly in the Army. I would imitate like my senior officers, and they never found out about it until just as I was getting out of the, out of the Army.
Is there a line? Is there like a quick line or phrase you can share in
Well,
that?
no, you wouldn't know who they were.
I know we don't
So
know the person, but we can imagine.
yeah, but I would be able to imitate some of the soldiers. Like if I was talking to my company commander or something, we would be always, with each other, and I'd be telling a funny story about somebody. And instead of just saying that they did that, I would just start saying it the way that sergeant or officer or whatever would have said it. And I remember one day my company commander, called a battery commander in the artillery, he said, "Do you just stand there in front of a mirror at home and practice these things?" I said, "No, it just kind of I guess it occurs to me." So that might be one. I don't do that quite as much now. It probably all started because I used to imitate my dad when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah.
Plus, I'm the youngest child, so they tend to be more creative and a bigger risk taker and funnier than the older ones. So
And more of a knucklehead, as you would say.
yes, yes, I embrace that. Yes.
Yeah, well, those are two really good examples. I could see that. I like your voiceover example because I've found that when we're watching stuff, I've started to realize that like I'm really, really good at identifying like random supporting actors or actresses and
Oh
realizing
yes, I know what you're
where where
talking
where
about.
they're from and other things. But for me, like so I feel like I'm skilled at that.
And does it bother you until you can figure out where you've seen
Oh
them
yeah,
before? Yeah.
absolutely,
Thank
absolutely.
goodness
So
for
it's
Wikipedia.
kind of like internal IMDb, but you take that to the next level because you're talking about just hearing them, not even seeing them. So that's like a whole expert level IMDb audio version that you got there.
Right. I think it may be something baked in that a lot of people have. Like my daughter has it, where I was very good at accents, like when I would speak German or Spanish or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just something about the way you can hear. It's not like I can sing. I'm tone deaf, but there was something about, I don't know, the way maybe your brain is able to capture the way something sounds, and then you can somehow file it away. Who knows? Who knows what's going on in that subconscious of mine?
Well, I think you're in the right line of work because it definitely translates well to audio. So Douglas, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. It's been so cool learning more about your story and all the lessons you've learned throughout your marketing book podcast journey and other life journeys as well. Where is the best place for people to connect with you and to listen to your podcast and anything else you want to call out?
Well, thanks. If they go to marketingbookpodcast.com, they'll find the section of our website that is all about the podcast and the interviews. I would suggest that if listeners, and I say this in every episode of my show, if I can recommend a specific marketing or sales book or other resource for whatever situation people find themselves in, connect with me on LinkedIn. My name again is Douglas Burdett, where we can chat and you can tell me what it is. And if I get really excited when I can recommend one specific book for somebody that I know is going to help them, because I don't want them to have to read 300 sales and marketing books. So it's
You
like,
don't?
no, well, it's like, oh, no, 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 don't read that one. Read this one. Actually, what I do is I send them a link to the interview I've done and I say, listen to this and see if that sounds like what you're talking about. And they usually come back and go, yes, that's it. I got the book and I'm going to read it. And then they'll come back and they'll say, now, okay, what's one I could read about such and such? So if I can do that, I think LinkedIn's probably the best place. And again, I'm happy to, and I get messages now every day, and it never takes much time, but I'm able to get people pointed in the right direction or make a suggestion. So I would suggest that they do that or visit marketingbookpodcast.com. And I'll make sure to include I'll give you that link to that one particular episode where it had the slides and the script that I did, as well as the audio from a presentation I gave that was about those three ideas that every marketer needs to know. And it includes references to several other books that they might find interesting.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And you are the human Spark Notes or Cliff Notes, whichever you prefer. And last thing here, stage is yours. Final thoughts. Send us off. It could be a line. It could be a quote. It could be an imitation, whatever you want.
Well, here's what I would suggest. If we are still in quarantine, whatever that means, when this does publish, go visit marketingbookcocktails.com. And that's the special series I've been doing 6 days a week, basically those days when I don't publish the author interview about their book. And I've just been talking to these authors about what's going on. And it's been really helpful for me, and the listeners are enjoying it. A lot of us don't quite still know what to think. And we're all sort of yearning to connect with one another. So I would suggest that folks go to marketingbookcocktails.com, and that'll take you to the section that's just on that authors in quarantine getting cocktails.
And that certainly calls for some cocktails. Thank you, Douglas, for sharing all of your stories and lessons and Spark Notes, Cliff Notes, whatever you want to call it. And thank you, Wild listeners, for tuning into another episode. If you want to hear more wild stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also check us out on Good Pods, where you can find all the podcasts your friends, family, and other favorite people are listening to. For more, you can dive into our marketing and business growth resources at hippodirect.com/blog and hippodirect.com/newsletter. That newsletter is the Hippo Digest, and it's your place for wild marketing ideas every single week. And last but certainly not least, come say hey on your favorite social media platform at the handles Hippo Direct and Max Branstetter. Until next time, let your business run wild.
Bring on the bongos!